What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. The Pokemon type chart has been a discussion from the very start, trying to parse out all the intricacies of what each type will do against the others, and for the most part it works pretty well, and with small tweaks that happen over time, there's a fair amount of balance across all of the 18 types. However, even with refinement, there are some type matchups that could be reworked a bit, whether to better accommodate slight imbalances or just by simply rationalizing the logic of how these elements should interact. So, here are the top 6 type matchups that need to be modified. Number 6. Rock should resist Bug. So the first thing in the type chart that never really made sense to me is the fact that currently Rock does not resist Bug. Yes, Bug is weak to Rock, but if the Bug survives and fires back, it's for neutral damage on the cold hard stone. Now, for whatever reason, Rock has always kind of been thought of as a defensive type, but when you look at it, Rock has 5 weaknesses and only 4 resistances. That is tied with Grass on all counts, and people rag on Grass all the time for how wimpy it is. My only guess is that this stemmed from a lack of coverage moves of other types in the early games, where most every move pool was made of normal type attacks, and Rock did resist those normal moves, but Rock is a far cry from the defenses of the Steel type that came in to completely replace it. But I think if Rock resisted Bug to at least make its weaknesses and resistances equal, that would help out a lot. And frankly, it doesn't even make sense when you think about it. Rock beats Bug because they can crush insects quite easily, but say that it misses. How is that Bug gonna fight back? By biting it or scratching it? I mean, if Bug resists ground because it is easy for them to travel through the dirt, then by that logic, it would be very hard for them to dig through a rock, and therefore Rock should resist Bug. It's not like Bug needs to be any weaker than it already is, but I don't know that a type that can already flatten them gaining a resistance would make it that much worse for the Bug type, but it would at least help out the pride of the Rock types a bit. Number 5. Fairy should be super effective against Fairy. Maybe this doesn't track, but you know what else doesn't track? The fact that only 2 types are weak to themselves. Ghost and Dragon are super effective against themselves, while all other types are neutral or mostly resist themselves instead. I don't know why they would introduce this feature and barely use it. It's almost like it's out of place, like if there were only one immunity in the whole type chart. So if you ask me, at least one more type should be super effective against itself, and I think it should be Fairy. Firstly, because it is the newest, it would have been easiest to implement it that way, and I see no reason for why their brand of magic couldn't fall prey to an equally powerful magic. Maybe I've just seen too many fantasy movies and that doesn't make sense, but I'll tell you another reason that I would like to see it. Fairy needs more weaknesses. Fairy is only weak to Poison and Steel, which is great for their offensive coverage, but nothing else is a fear for these mystical nymphs. And they have twice as many resistances, counting the complete immunity to even the toughest of dragons. So I think if we combined the extra weakness that's needed with the ability for Fairy to be even better offensively, but not really alter how it can go head to head with other types, just make them able to hit each other for extra damage, creating a little bit more risk-reward for when you have a full-on Fae fight. Is that actually enough reason to do it? I don't know, but it would be pretty cool to me if they were more self-effective, and if fairies were a little bit nervous that they could fall to their own Moonblast. Number 4. Poison should be super effective against water. So when looking at the Poison type coverage, it's super effective against the types of Grass and Fairy, and that's it. And when you think about it, Fairy is still pretty new, so Poison went just as long with its advantages being tied with types that are immune to it with Steel. That's pretty bad, so Poison should be super effective against something else, and to me it would make sense if that type were water. Apparently, it's really easy to pollute water. We do it accidentally sometimes, and that has detrimental effects on anything living in it, you know, like all the water-type Pokemon that inhabit everywhere. Now, does this make more sense than reverting back to Poison and Bug being super effective against each other like in Gen 1? Not necessarily. However, as much as pesticides are a thing, I think Bug has enough problems as is, whereas if we look back at water, it's basically the inverse of Poison because it only has 2 weaknesses, those being Grass and Electric. Now, maybe they didn't do this because in Gen 1, Poison was so common that they didn't want to disadvantage anyone that picked Squirtle, But there are also plenty of grass types in the early stages of every game, so I don't really see a difference. And it would only increase the value of certain water combinations that would be more equipped to take on those toxic threats. I'm not saying that water needs another liability, but poison definitely needs a little more offensive punch, even with the addition of the fairy type. And if you think about it logically, poisoning the water supply should be a pretty big deal. Poison doesn't even need to resist it because you can wash away some toxins as well. However, poison is pretty outclassed by most other types offensively. I guess they figured that a chance to poison the target makes up for that, but it would be nice to have an even better reason to pack some of these poison moves for actually useful coverage. Number 3. Electric should be super effective against Steel. This one is by far the type matchup that makes the least amount of sense to me. I get that Electric resists Steel, and that's fine because when you think about it, if you try and use a sword to stab lightning, you won't do that much. But even a child would realize that if you did stab the lightning, you would quickly become electrocuted because metal is pretty renowned for being a conductor of electricity. People praise some type matchups for their scientific consistency, like flying being immune to ground, or ground being immune to electric itself. So then what happened here with the steel type? I mean, if we're expected to believe that grass resists electric attacks because wood is a poor conductor of electricity, then why would a substance that allows currents to flow far more freely not be ravaged by such high voltage coursing all throughout? I mean, that's why water is weak to electric, right? And despite electric being deemed somewhat essential, it isn't really all that dominant, since it only hits 2 types, water and flying, for super effective damage. Contrast that with steel that already has 10 resistances and an immunity, and I think it could afford at least 1 extra weakness. And actually, if you reinstated the resistances that it used to have to Dark and Ghost, then you would only be left with Electric and Water as neutral. So if you wanted it to be a zero-sum game of either or, and only have effective or resisted hits from every other type, I could see that being Steel's gimmick. I mean, water rusting the metal would probably make sense as well, but that's all beside the point. Steel would be fine gaining 1 extra weakness that happens to follow the laws of basic physics, especially when it helps Electric be a bit more advantageous in battle, you know, besides just being a niche for paralyzing everything on the spot. Number 2. Ghost should be super effective against something. So, the Ghost type has an interesting history. Its whole existence can be chalked up to they needed some kind of counter to the Psychic type. But a glitch made the opposite happen, meaning that it failed at its one job. But hey, they fixed that in Gen 2, and the Dark type was brought in to totally replace it. Okay. To be fair, Ghost is the only type that has 2 immunities to normal and fighting, so that's a nice unique feature, but Dark is immune to Psychic, making it the far better choice between the two for that specific task. But what's even worse to me is that the only other type that both Ghost and Dark are super effective against is Ghost. So they are completely redundant for offensive capabilities, except that Ghost is clearly inferior since Dark resists Ghost, while the Spectres can't even handle their own otherworldly power. Not to mention that normal being immune to Ghost means that it's really hard to justify why you should use any Ghost moves when you could just try Dark instead. So I think it's only fair to give Ghost at least 1 area where it could actually shine, you know, other than just being immune to trapping moves, I guess. So when looking at the type chart, what do we think could be best? Well, I could see it being super effective against Fairy. I mean, their magic and the spirits from beyond might not mix, so I could see a power dynamic there. It is a shame that they missed that opportunity when Fairy first came out, so maybe they see something I don't to avoid the idea. Fine. I do think that it would be fitting for Ghost to be super effective against fighting. While the other immunity to normal does cancel out, it is a bit strange for nothing similar to happen with fighting. I get that it's not really possible to karate chop a Ghost. However, somehow biting a Ghost causes critical damage, so consistency is kind of out the window here. You might say, you can't have Ghost beat Psychic and then beat Fighting, that wouldn't be fair. You mean like how Fire beats Bug and then Grass as well? Or how Grass itself beats Water, which beats Ground, which beats Rock, while Grass beats all of them? Yeah, the type chart is full of this stuff. But hey, if Ghosts had been super effective against Fighting as a consolation prize for the mess-ups in Gen 1, we might not have even needed Fairy to nerf that overused type in the first place. although I guess dragons still would have been a problem. But most importantly, this would set Ghost apart from Dark very heavily, since Dark is weak to fighting. So if Ghost were the opposite and super effective, it would truly give a reason to utilize it over Dark, instead of just solely for stab damage boosts sometimes. Number 1. Ice should resist flying. I get the idea behind why ice is so frail, because you can generally just kind of break it with a light tap, but as we've mentioned before, the people making these choices aren't always so bothered with keeping close to real life in their typing decisions. And perhaps most importantly, this is a game that you're designing. So even if something is a bit more realistic but leads to poor gameplay, you might want to reconsider your priorities and try putting the having fun part first. Because ice does not have the most weaknesses out there, but it is practically non-existent on the defensive side. As of right now, ice only resists itself. It's often classified as a glass cannon type. However, it also does not have the most super effective hits of any type either, with just as many types that resist its frosty power. So I don't know that you can really call it a cannon when other types hit just as hard, or in some cases, harder. I guess they think that the unique chance to freeze opponents makes up for that, but it very rarely happens, so you'll probably die long before you ever see it. And what's really insulting is when they keep trying to make defensive ice types, because they could melt faster than a popsicle would on a Slateport beach. So if you ask me, it's not that hard to figure out one extra teeny little buff that the ice type could get, that being the newly minted resistance to the flying type. Ice already beats flying, so why not go all out like many other type matchups and have the flying moves be resisted as well? If you're not convinced, then just think about it this way. Imagine a giant glacier. Now a bird comes along and slaps it with its wing. Exactly how much damage do you think that's gonna do? Or better yet, that bird whips up a gust of wind. Do you think anything more would happen than a light wisp of the top layer of snow blowing away? A mountain made out of ice is not going to take much damage at all from a slight breeze. I mean, what's a tiny bird gonna do? Sharpen its beak on it? It would take at least 100 years for it to chisel away. Ice is definitely in need of some help, even if it just resisted one more type. And when thinking about how every other element would interact with a big frozen block of water, I can only keep imagining how badly the flying type would perform against it. At least far worse than any others like Psychic or Ground or even Poison. And I don't really think that flying having one more type resisted would be the end of the world for them either, since they are generally still going to be incredibly fast Pokémon, maybe able to take out ice with some different coverage moves, or at the very least fight back with their own separate stab attacks, since they generally always have a secondary type paired with flying anyway. So if there were only one possible change that I could make to the type chart going forward, I would absolutely throw ice the smallest of bones and let them resist one solitary other type. So, those are the top Pokemon type matchups I think should be changed. Which type relationships would you alter? Let me know down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And until next time, stay grounded.